Rabbi Yehuda Loew, known to the pious as the Maharal, came to Prague from Nikolsburg, Posen, in the year 5332 of the creation, 1572 CE, in order to become rabbi of the community there. The whole world resounded with his fame because he was deeply learned in all branches of knowledge and knew many languages. Is it any wonder, then, that he was revered by the wise men among the Gentiles? Even King Rudolph of Bohemia esteemed him highly. Because of these reasons, the Maharal was able to wage war successfully against the enemies of Israel, who tried to besmirch Jewish honor with their false blood accusations. After much sad experience, in the course of which these frightful slanders were fully exposed in the brilliant light of truth, King Rudolph assured Rabbi Yehuda Loew that never again would he permit any blood accusation to be charged against the Jews in his kingdom. When the Maharal first came to Prague, the blood accusation was a very common occurrence there, and much innocent Jewish blood was spilled because of it. Immediately on his arrival, Rabbi Yehuda Loew announced that he would fight against this unholy calumny with all his power in order to silence the enemies of his people who so tirelessly plotted for its destruction. One day, King Rudolph sent his carriage to fetch the Maharal for an audience with him. They talked together for a whole hour, but what was said during their meeting nobody knows to this very day. The Maharal returned home in a gay mood. He told his intimates, "I have already half destroyed the filthy myth of the blood accusation. With God's help, I hope soon to wash away entirely this hideous stain from our innocent people." And the Maharal's hope was soon fulfilled. To his joy, and to the joy of all the Jews of Bohemia, the king issued a decree 10 days later, announcing that no one, besides the particular individual charged in a blood accusation, had to stand trial. Prior to that, all the Jews were collectively charged with the alleged crime. Furthermore, that the individual accused could not be condemned unless there was positive proof of his guilt in the crime. The king also ordered that, during any trial on such a charge, the Rabbi of Prague had to be present, nor could the verdict be valid unless the king himself countersigned the judge's sentence. One would have thought that the king's decree would put an end to the shameless slander that the Jews had a custom which required them to use Christian blood in the baking of the Passover Matzah, but the enemies of Israel were endlessly resourceful that way. All that it required for a Christian who wished to destroy a Jew was stealthily to plant a dead child in his house, and the hue and cry of the blood accusation was on again. Only in rare cases was it possible for the Jew to extricate himself from the fine meshes of the net his enemies entangled him in. There was one man in the kingdom of Bohemia of whom the Maharal stood in great dread. This was the priest Thaddeus. He was not only an implacable enemy of the Jews, but a clever sorcerer besides. He was determined to carry on a war to the death against the Maharal. The Maharal too girded himself for battle against this enemy. One night the Maharal called upon heaven to answer him in a dream how best he could wage successful war against his enemy Thaddeus, and the answer came to him in the alphabetically arranged words of the Kabbala: "Create a golem out of clay who will destroy all the enemies of Israel." The Maharal knew that in the Hebrew words of this formula there were stored enough mystical secrets by means of whose powers he could create a golem. He then confided his secret to Isaac ben Shimshon HaKohen, his son-in-law, and to his principal disciple, Jacob ben Chaim Halevi. He told them that he would require their help because they were born under the constellations of fire and water, respectively. The Maharal himself was born under the constellation of air. To the making of the golem, all the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth were necessary. He then cautioned the two against revealing his plan to anyone, and instructed them that, during the next 7 days, they were to purify their bodies and souls with ablutions, fasting, prayer, and austerities. It was on the 2nd day in the month of Adar, in the year 5340 of creation, that the momentous event took place. At 4 in the morning the 3 made their way out of the city to Moldau. There, on the clay bank of the river, they molded the figure of a man 3 ells in length. They fashioned for him hands and feet and a head, and drew his features in clear human relief. Having done this, the three stationed themselves at the feet of the prostrate golem. The Maharal then ordered Isaac ben Shimshon HaKohen to encircle the figure 7 times from right to left. He also revealed to him the Kabbalistic incantations he was to pronounce while doing so. No sooner had the Maharal's son-in-law completed his task when the golem began to glow like fire. Then the Maharal asked Jacob ben Chaim Halevi to do the same circling, but he instructed him to utter different Kabbalistic formulae and to encircle the figure from left to right. As soon as he was through, the fire in the golem was quenched, and a cloud of steam arose from its body. When it cleared, they saw that hair had grown on its head and that nails had appeared on its fingers and toes. Next, the Maharal himself began to circle around the golem 7 times. Then, with one voice, all three recited the scriptural passage from Genesis. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Immediately, the golem opened his eyes and looked at the 3 men wonderingly. "Get up on your feet," commanded the Maharal. The golem stood up, and they dressed him in clothes they had brought with them, clothes that were fitting for a Shammes. Most wonderful to relate, when they had left Prague 2 hours before, they were only 3. But when 6 o'clock struck, there were 4 of them returning. On the way home, the Maharal said to the golem, "Know that we have created you so that you may protect the defenseless Jews against their enemies. Your name is Joseph, and you will serve me as Shammes in the house of judgment. You must obey me no matter what I tell you to do, even should I ask you to jump into fire and water." Although the golem could not speak, for the power of speech is God's alone to give, he nonetheless understood what the Maharal said to him. He had a remarkable sense of hearing, and could detect sounds from a very great distance. To his 2 disciples the Maharal said that he had named the golem Joseph because he had implanted in him the spirit of Joseph Shida, he who was half man and half demon, and who had saved the sages of the Talmud from many trials and dangers. When the Maharal came home, he told his wife, Perel, the Rebbitzen, pointing to the golem, that he had met the poor unfortunate, plainly a mute idiot, on the street, and that he felt very sorry for him, and so he brought him home with him. "He will serve me as Shammes in the house of judgment," he said. At the same time, the Maharal forbade anyone to give the golem any menial tasks to perform, for he had not created him for that. And so the golem sat always in a corner of the house of judgment, with expressionless face cupped in his hands, just like a clay golem who has no thought in his head. Because he behaved like a mute idiot, people began to call him derisively Yosele Golem. Others called him Dumb Yosele. Despite the Maharal's orders against giving Yosele Golem any tasks to perform, his wife, Perel, the Rebbitzen, disobeyed him. One day, just before Passover, she motioned to him to fetch water from the well, and to fill the 2 big barrels in the pantry with water for the holy day. Yosele Golem quickly snatched 2 buckets and ran with them to the well. As the Rebbitzen was preoccupied with other matters, she did not observe what he was doing. To the well and back again he ran so many times that, without anyone noticing it, the barrels began to overflow, and soon the water spread through the house. At this the servants raised a great outcry and ran to tell the Maharal. When Rabbi Loew came and saw what Yosele Golem had done, he burst out laughing and said to the Rebbitzen, My, what a wonderful water carrier you got yourself for Passover." He then went and took away the buckets from the golem, and led him back into his corner in the house of judgment. From that time on, the Rebbitzen never again asked Yosele Golem to do anything for her. But when the story got around in Prague, everybody laughed. It even gave rise to a new saying, "You're as good a watchmaker as Yosele Golem is a water carrier." The Maharal employed the golem to protect the Jews of Prague against the dangers that threatened them. With his assistance he was able to perform many miracles. Most of all, he used him in his war against the blood accusations, which were again rife in the land, and which caused so much sorrow to the Jews. In such cases, when the Maharal had to send Yosele Golem on a dangerous mission, he found it advisable to make him invisible by means of an amulet upon which was written a Kabbalistic word. In the period before Passover, which coincides with the Christian Easter, a time when the blood accusation was usually brought, the Maharal made Yosele Golem put on a disguise. He had him dress up like a Christian, and made him wear a rope around his middle in order that he might look like any ordinary Gentile porter. The Maharal ordered him to guard the ghetto of Prague like the apple of his eye, to roam all its streets at night, and to be on the lookout against those who might wish to do evil to the Jews. He was to examine the contents of every passing wagon and of every bundle carried by a passer-by. If he but suspected someone of making preparations for bringing a blood accusation against the Jews, he was to bind the malefactor with his rope and bring him straight away to the city watch in the Rathaus. It so happened that the leading Jew of Prague in communal matters was the wealthy Reb Mordecai Yosele. One of his debtors, a Christian who ran a slaughterhouse, owed him 5,000 crowns. Time and again, Reb Mordecai demanded of the slaughterer that he return the money, but each time the latter declined to pay on some pretext or other. Now the slaughterhouse was situated outside the city, and the slaughterer was in the habit of conveying meat into the city through the Jewish ghetto. This put the idea into his head of accusing Reb Mordecai of having used Christian blood for the baking of Matzah. Several days before Passover, the child of a Christian neighbor of the slaughterer's died. It was buried in the Christian cemetery. Late that night the slaughterer stole into the cemetery and dug up the child. He then killed a pig in the slaughterhouse and cleaned out its insides. He cut the throat of the dead child and, wrapping it in the folds of the tallis, he put it inside the pig. Afterwards he rode to town, intending to secrete the body in Reb Mordecai's house while he slept. When the slaughterer was near Reb Mordecai's house, Yosele, who was then roaming the streets, suddenly appeared and insisted on examining the contents of his wagon. When he saw the dead child and the pig's carcass, he quickly bound the slaughterer with his rope and carried him to the town watch right in the Rathaus. He dumped him in the courtyard and hurried away. A great commotion was heard in the Rathaus. The watch was called out. They brought lights and saw before them the slaughterer, lying tied hand and foot and looking bruised and swollen. They examined the pig and found the dead child and its carcass. Seeing that it was wrapped in a Jewish tallis, the chief of the watch clearly saw that it was a blood accusation plot. After close questioning, the slaughterer confessed what he was up to. When he was asked who had brought him to the city watch, he answered, "It was a Christian porter who was mute. He was an enormous fellow who looked more like a devil than a man." No one had any idea who this strange creature could be. A great terror fell upon all enemies of Israel. Only Thaddeus the priest understood from what quarter this secret power could have come. So he had the rumor spread in town that the Maharal was a sorcerer, in order to discredit him in the eyes of all upright Christians who respected him, and he intensified his struggle against him and all the Jews with a consuming hatred. When King Rudolph saw that there was no foundation whatsoever for any of the blood accusations, he became angry at the priest Thaddeus. The pleas and persuasion of the Maharal at last had their effect. The king issued a solemn decree under his own seal, forbidding anyone in his realm from ever raising the blood accusation against any Jew or group of Jews. Neither were the courts of the kingdom to honor such charges, because the sin of accusing the innocent with crimes they had not committed always falls like a blight upon the entire nation. Once again Passover came around, but not one blood accusation was raised in the kingdom of Bohemia that year. It seemed as if King Rudolph's decree had effectively silenced the enemy. Thereupon the Maharal called his son-in-law and his disciple, both of whom had assisted in the creation of the golem, and said to them, "I have called you to tell you that the golem is no longer needed. The lie of the blood accusation will never be raised in this country again." This took place on the night of Lag BaOmer, in the year 5350 of the creation. That night the Maharal said to Yosele, "Don't sleep tonight in the house of judgment, but instead go up into the attic of the synagogue and make your bed there." Ever obedient, Yosele did as the Maharal told him. After midnight, accompanied by his son-in-law and his disciple, the Maharal ascended to the attic of the synagogue and stationed himself before the sleeping giant. They now took their places in reverse position to that when they created him. They stood at his head and gazed into his face. Then they began to circle around him, beginning from left to right. They did this 7 times, intoning Kabbalistic incantations and formulae. All this time the old Shammes, Reb Abraham Chaim, whom the Maharal had brought to assist him, stood at a discreet distance from the golem, lighting him up with 2 waxen candles. Upon the completion of the 7th encirclement, the golem lay rigid in death. He looked again like a hunk of hardened clay. The Maharal took the 2 candles from the Shammes and had him divest the golem of his clothes, except for the shirt. They then took some old discarded prayer shawls and wrapped them securely around him. Afterwards they covered him with thousands upon thousands of discarded leaves from old prayer books, so that he was altogether hidden from sight. The Maharal also told the Shammes not to breathe a word to any living soul of what he had seen that night, and to burn the golem's clothes when no one saw. Then they all descended from the attic. They washed their hands and uttered prayers of purification, as one usually does after being near a corpse. In the morning the Maharal had a report spread throughout Prague, that his Shammes, Yosele, had quarreled with him and had left the city at night. Everybody accepted the report as true, except the 3 who had the privilege of going up to the attic with the Maharal the previous night. 1 week later, the Maharal had a proclamation posted and read in the shul forbidding any Jew, on pain of excommunication, ever to go up to the synagogue attic. The reverence for Rabbi Loew was so great that no one dared look for the golem in the attic. It is believed that he is still lying there, buried deep under a heap of torn leaves from old prayer books, and only waiting for the coming of the Messiah, or for the time when new dangers appear to menace the existence of Israel, to rise again and smite the foe.